start, but before we start, can I have everyone kind of come a little bit closer if you would? To the front. Like you guys in the back. It's not class, there's no test. Unless you don't come to the front.
No, like there could be detention.
Oh, that'd be
You're
better.
not in the right seat at the right time.
So thank you all for coming today. We are very grateful for Diane Barile to speak with us today. She's a local historian, a founder of the Marine Resources Council, and of course one of our board members. She's volunteered to speak to us today about Betty Jumper. It's going to be real interesting and it's a wonderful format. So without further ado, let's welcome Diane.
Thank you very much. I really wanted today, I'm electronically disabled. And besides that, there have been so many talks where they turn the lights out and then things click, and then if you really wanted to see something again, you couldn't see it. So I've put out books and things, I've put out things that you can see. I'll pass some things around, but I thought this would be sort of like, I don't know if you had a grandmother like I did, but you sat on the front porch and talked, and that's where you heard the stories. That's where Betty Jumper heard the stories. And I was almost going to have a little fireplace here because there are only 4 logs on a Seminole fire, and they cross like this, and they're big long logs, and then you can just keep pushing them in. So everything was by 4s for them. But I really wanted the feeling of something a little more intimate, because I'm telling you, and I'm remembering things from growing up. And it's kind of important, and it's things that I have wondered about all my life since I was 11 years old. How did Betty Jumper get there, and how did it work? Where did they come from? It's not written down. They did not write things down, and so if you talk about the Seminole Wars, what you hear is what the generals did to some Indians whose name they didn't know, because they would fight the Indians, and then the Indians would disappear. And they'd think they won. But they had more dead than the Indians did. But and the women, there are no women's names anywhere. You have to dig everywhere to find a woman's name. Even on the census, and when they were putting on ships and sending them to Arkansas, which later became Oklahoma, it would list the man's name and then wife and children. When they were sending them off on the rosters, it would be so many warriors and women and children. So finding and following women was a mess. This all started because I really thought I was an Indian. My father, I think it was 3rd grade where you study the Pilgrims, and half the people in my class were descended from the Pilgrims, and I went home and asked my dad, and he gave the old Will Rogers response: "Your ancestors met the Mayflower. Go back and tell them that." And we acted like Indians, as kids. So it was probably right. But we moved to Florida, and I'm titling this, my friend Betty Mae Jumper Tiger, Rebel with a Cause. This was a woman who was one of the most amazing people I've ever tried to know, and I think she would call me a friend. When we moved to Florida, my father had a nice, stable, everyday job during the war in Pennsylvania, but he wanted to be a salesman, and we came to Florida, and he decided he was going to supply gift shops. If you've ever been to a Stuckey's, you know my dad. He was selling seashells. Truckloads of seashells, coconuts. He had the contract to cut all the coconuts off the trees in Hollywood, Florida. They put them in a truck, and then they'd sell them at the gift shop. But he got to know one of his clients was the Chimpanzee farm in Dania, Florida, and it had been a rich exploring couple, and their son went all over the world, and they brought these animals back and had them in cages in Dania. So my dad got us a job there. My brother and I, we were 10 and 11, and our job was to hide in the shrubbery, and when people parked their car, we would sneak out and put the bumper sticker on the front, not the back, because these people were headed north, and they wanted them to see the cars coming from Florida with the well, then what also happened is that there was an Indian village. Now the tourists would get on the boat down at the yacht basin by the beach, and they think they were going out in the jungle, and they were on the Jungle Queen. But the Jungle Queen stopped at a village at the chimpanzee farm right under US 1. So they hadn't gone that far. but there was an Indian village, and said there was the chickie. You know what a chickie is? It's like 4 posts. It has a platform about 3 feet off the ground, and the roof is palmettos woven in and on a lap. So we would go down and play with the kids. Now, I don't know how many of you remember, what's the ball? But there's a big pole, and there's a ball and a tetherball.
Tetherball.
Well, this was before there was tetherball, and their tetherball was fabric wrapped with string and fabric wrapped in string. It was like granite. And we would play tetherball with them. For those of you who have not played tetherball, there's a big pole, there's a line down the center, people are on each side, and you try to get it around without the other person patting it back. I still have dents. They were quick. The biggest joke with this is that when the boat would come in, when the Jungle Queen would come in, the kids would grab a can and stand out there, and people would put money in the can. And my brother says, "Diane, they're making more money with the can than we are in the parking lot. Get a can." So we already knew we were Indians. My dad told us. So we were the only blue-eyed Indians with a can as the tourist there. But the other thing that happened is my dad then got to know Betty pretty well, and she invited us to come out to the Indian Reservation in Dania. It's now called the Hollywood Reservation. Then it was the Dania Reservation. And we would go out on Saturdays, and he would trade. Somebody just asked me where'd they get the fabric, and I told him my dad sold it to him. He would bring the buttons and fabric and beads, and he would buy the skirts and the dolls and so forth. So, and Betty was the person who had been to school. She spoke English, Meckasuki, and Muskogee. So she could talk to any of the people in the reservation. That reservation had both the Seminoles and the Meckasukis. They did not mix very well, and then each clan within those groups had their own camp. So we would go from camp to camp and visit. So that's how I got to know Betty. And then through the years, we kept in touch with one another now and then. And I'll tell you some more about that. But, so how did Betty get to that reservation? And what happened to her even after I knew her there? Well, she was born outside Indiantown. Her mother and her grandmother lived in this camp. And they were, if you know where Indiantown is, it's north and east of Lake Okeechobee. And her grandfather was Tom Tiger. And lots of pictures of Tom Tiger, because he's the one that met the president, and he was there that met the first train that came into Kissimmee. An absolutely handsome man. There's some pictures of him in the books over there. And he had died. He was making a canoe out here on, I think about Blue Cypress Lake, and was struck by lightning. And so his family came and they buried him there. They cut the canoe in half, put him in the canoe and with all his belongings, and left him there. Unfortunately, there was a man coming from Pennsylvania who decided he wanted Indian bones for a museum and dug them up. And they had a big court case. The Indians said, we're going on the warpath. And that was 1907. And they decided that they would get the bones back. But so she was there with her grandmother, Mary, her daughter, Ada. And then Mary's brother, Jim Gopher, who Betty saw as her grandfather. Now, there was a problem. Betty was a half-breed. And I found that her mother couldn't get married because she was not of the same clan, and they weren't talking to the other people, and so it was tough. So they were in a really, really good position there. They had cattle, they had hogs, they had chickens, and they worked for white farmers, including cutting cane. Well, what happened is, this is a quote from the Indian agent. He said, "I was all over 3 counties in an effort to make the father of the oldest half-breed child support his baby. He and the boys had joked these girls about being their sweethearts and had given them whiskey they couldn't drink, all they could drink, and had gone their way. The mother of the oldest child had ruined my case by, he was going to take them to court because, he's having to pay out government money. But she wouldn't go, wouldn't testify unless she was paid. So she wouldn't, and they don't want to go to court. They don't want to be around white people at all. So that's probably what happened. And that was Betty's father, and I've traced him down. He, in fact, had a family in Fort Pierce, and went on, and I think he died in 1961. But Betty never knew him. Now the problem was, the rule with the Indians was that half-breeds were killed. They were not to live. Usually it was the grandmother or one of the aunts that killed the baby. Fortunately, Jim Gopher had become a Christian in 1920, and he said there'll be no more baby killings. But what were they going to do? Betty's mother, Ada, was like a medicine woman, and Jim Gopher was the medicine man. Usually she delivered the babies. So they went to Elizabeth Yates Savage, the wife of one of the ranchers. Sis Savage was her name. And she delivered the baby, and then took the baby to her daughter-in-law, who was Fanny Canada Savage. And she wet nursed Betty until Betty's uncle Dan Parker came and got her and took her back. So she lived then in the village there at Indiantown. And then in Indiantown, the white people started moving in and were adjacent to them. And I thought maybe we would have a visitor today. I met Iris Walls, who was the daughter of a rancher in that area. Her grandmother ran the store and got to know Betty, and she knew all the Indians coming and going, and became friends with Betty through the years. And so Iris knew the family for a long time, and she's 88, and I just met her a couple of weeks ago, and she has all kinds of stories about Betty. The reason that, and Jim Gopher had really had a firm commitment to no more babies killing. In the 1920s, he went down to Dania to Annie Tommy's granddaughter was born, and he was running down to get her and had people to take care of the baby, and the baby was dead before he got there. In 1925, she has a brother born, Howard. Her brother was born by another husband. I'm going to track that one down too. About 1925-26, the other medicine men came from the other tribe or other group. They were coming to get Betty and Howard. That they couldn't tolerate having them around anymore. So Ada took her children and ran off into the woods. Jim said, you're not coming in here, we're not doing that anymore. They wouldn't leave. He shot up in the air. They got in the car and left, jumped in their Model T. But they went and got the sheriff. The sheriff came and said, "You're not firing guns at people," and so forth, and puts them in jail. Then things get a little thick because he's in jail and he's got no way to get out. The Indian agent comes and says, "Look, I'm going to get you out, but I want you to come with me." Takes him to the Dania Reservation and he says, "I want you to move in here." And he's saying, "No, we like where we are, we're happy, he said, "Within a year, you're coming." So Jim walks from Miami to Indiantown, where they stayed, and then the Indian agent cuts their food supply. They were getting a stipend or something from the government. It was cut. The other thing that happened that I found out 2 weeks ago, the other thing that happened is all the land around Indiantown had been bought by the man who was the president or vice president of the railroad. And he was going to build, that's where we get the hotel that's in Indiantown. He built this beautiful hotel, and this was going to be the rail center for the, I forget which railroad, but he was going to have the roundhouse there, the supplies, the repairs, and so forth. This was going to be Phantasmagoria. And I kind of think that he was not happy having a bunch of Indians living nearby. That's just my feel for it. And, we're on the porch, right? At any rate, they leave, and they move to Dania. Now, the Dania Reservation had originally been planned for just sick Indians, for people that needed help and so forth. But the agent really wanted to get more people there. The other thing is he wanted a school. He wanted to really, education was the thing that they felt the children needed. So he was trying to get enough kids to go to the school, and I think that may be part of the reason for trying to get them there. While they were there, this Annie Tommy, old lady who had been in Miami and along the Tamiami Trail. When they built the road from Miami to Tampa, they built the Tamiami Trail, so the Indians went out there and they had Indian villages and so forth. But there was an Episcopal missionary, Harriet Vidal, who was trying to get them to improve their crafts, and she taught them to make the dolls and taught them to make the baskets with the sweetgrass and the patchwork, and started with some of that. They had been doing some of it, but not to the quality that Ms. Vidal thought was good. But so Annie's there, and so she teaches Ada and anybody else in the reservation to make dolls, so that they had something to sell, which is what my dad was there for. To backtrack a little bit, in 1933 they went to the first Green Corn Dance. Now the Green Corn Dance is not a dance. I mean, the dance is part of the thinking and the meditation and so forth, but it's where all the decisions are made. And the elders are like the judge and the jury. If you've done something wrong that year, they take care of it there, to the point of killing people. I can remember at the reservation there was one white guy that was always around the reservation, and I asked my dad about it, and they said, "Oh, they took his wife away at the Green Corn Dance, and he's waiting for her to come back." But if things were not the way they should be, it was taken care of there. So in 1933 was the first time since Betty had been born that they went back to the Green Corn Dance and were accepted. And the title of this, is My Friend Betty, but I think she was a rebel with a cause. Here she was alive by the grace of God, actually. She was being accepted. One of the things that bothered her was that her mother delivered the babies. And Betty saw, and she told me this years ago, that she just determined that she was not going to have so many babies die. She had to do something. She had to do something to help her people so that these things didn't happen anymore. The interesting thing is, so many of the Seminoles were sent to Oklahoma, and they all wore, white people clothes, and they were Baptist church, and they kept coming back and trying to convert and talk to the Southern Seminoles. The Seminoles wouldn't even talk to them. One whole group came and camped right outside of Indiantown for 3 months, and they never spoke to them. They didn't want anything to do with them. So by 1936, Jim Gopher and his one friend, there was a church, and they were probably the only 2 people that went to this church, but they were there, all the time. And so Betty and her cousin, Agnes Parker, got sent to Oklahoma in the summer. And an amazing thing happened. This is the life-changing point in Betty's life. One of the girls had a cartoon, she called them funny books. We did too. Cartoon books. And she saw the cartoon book and she said, they're talking. The girl told her, they're talking. They're saying something. And Betty's mind exploded. She was going to learn to read funny books. That was the whole, the Seminoles to books and writing were bad, because what her grandmother told her is anybody that gets mixed up with books, they're never the same. We're not going to have that here, It's not going to happen, kid, just forget it. But Betty decides now that she's going to go. One other thing I ought to show you is when they moved to the reservation. They've been living in something, and I'm going to pass this as well. They've been living like this outside. When it was cold, they went one place. When it was warm, they went somebody else. This is what the housing was like at the reservation, and even the agent said it shows you what Betty May was talking about. She was complaining. This is a kid. You've heard the rhyme, 10 little Indians all in a row. They're 10 little row houses, and they're 10 feet by 18, and half of that was a porch. Now you're going to put your whole family in there. And so Betty and her family, I'll pass this around, when they got the reservation, there were some people squatting, and then they had a house and everything on this property. So Betty's family moved in. And so it wasn't the best house you could have, but they liked it. In the meantime, they built this house for the Indian agent. And he kind of thought that was a mistake to make it this big. And he said the Indians at the unit had inadequate housing, that my efforts were turned to giving them something better. So he starts building some other houses for them. And Betty May was one of the bright and attractive young students at our school and lived in the white squatters' abandoned home. The house was nothing. Leaked in every room, was infested. I got some lumber together and wrecked the old house and built a nice little cottage. She was naughty one day, and I said, Betty May, you must not treat us that way. We have built you a nice home. And she answered, you build upstairs. In other words, the whites had the best house. So you can take a look at that. So Betty, had an edge. The other thing is that the other kids, didn't want her around because she wasn't a Seminole. She took a lot of abuse, and she had her little brother. She was always getting in a fight protecting her brother. So she thought maybe she'd stay at school or she'd go to school in Oklahoma, but she came home because it was too hot. Because you understand, they've lived outside. They've lived where the breezes. They were adjusted, but that was too hot. So she asked her parents she could go to a white school. Well, in 15, there had been some Seminoles that went to the high school, but now they said, no, can't go. This is 1937. So she had a friend that went to the black school, and she went there, and they said, no, you're not black. So she had a problem. One of the guiding lights of the Seminole, I think of all of the Seminoles, was Mrs. Stranahan. And if you don't know who Stranahan was, he lived here. He clerked in one of the stores here. And then moved and opened a trading post on the New River in Fort Lauderdale. And it was the Stranahan trading post, and he knew all of the Seminoles. And he married a school teacher. And she was a powerhouse. She got behind, and whatever the Indians needed, she would do. If they earned a little money, they picked beans and potatoes and so forth, and got a little money, and their mother would take them to the movies in Fort Lauderdale, and then they'd spend the night with Mrs. Stranahan, and she'd teach them Sunday school in the morning and bring them home. So when Betty decided that she wanted to go to school, and she got permission from the Indian agent, Mrs. Stranahan and her friends from Fort Lauderdale got behind them. Betty had never worn, American clothes before. So Mrs. Stranahan, she and her cousin who was going with her, got them dressed and everything to go. As they're thinking about going, her brother starts crying because he's never been without his sister, and he's going to get beat up really bad if she's not around. So he goes to school too, and they go to the Cherokee school in North Carolina. Now you understand, she didn't know English. She didn't speak English. They only spoke. She spoke Miccosukee and Muskogee, like her grandfather, her uncle did. So at 14, she starts to learn English. So and then there were some others from the Seminoles that went to school with her too. Of course, Agnes Parker, Howard Tiger, her brother, and Moses Jumper. So it was pretty interesting. During the 30s, during the New Deal, somehow they got hooked up with Eckes, who was Roosevelt's right-hand man. And they made a deal that they were going to get some cattle. They're going to teach these people to handle cattle. These are the people that had the Spanish cows in 1700s. One of the chiefs' name was Cowkeeper. If you've ever gone to Gainesville and gone over Prain's Prairie, well, Prain was the Indian chief. They had huge herds of cattle. But in the 1830s, we had the people moved in from Georgia, people by the name of Barker and Mizell, lived in North Florida, and by that time the Indians had been on a reservation that was only inside the state. They were taken away from the coast because they didn't want them to talk to anybody outside. Because you understand that they could go in canoes from Florida to Cuba and Nassau. So that was blocked. But they had told them that they were being shipped to Arkansas, so they didn't plant anything, and then they didn't get shipped, and now they're out of food, and they killed a cow outside the reservation. Now you have to understand that the Mizells and the Barbers were already stealing their cattle. And there's a book over there, The Way It Was. I mean, they did. That started the war. So now they go into a second really terrible war. But these people that the U.S. government is going to teach to raise cattle had been raising cattle all along. Ada when they left Indiantown, had to leave all her cattle and her pigs. There was no room on the reservation. So finally she got enough money to buy a Model T Ford, and she would go back up and kill a cow or something and bring it back so they had food. So at any rate, they brought some cows from Texas. I guess it was the Dust Bowl, and they had cows were dying, so they brought them some cows, and they opened a reservation called Brighton. And I can remember when we went to the reservation, there were no men around. And you'd ask where they were. Well, they were at Brighton. And so there's a casino. I was telling the board today, it's the most uncanny thing you've ever seen. You drive through, you know, lots of ranch land and pastures and nowhere. And then you get to the Brighton Reservation, and all the arrows point to this square building. I mean, it looks pretty inane. You walk in and it's, you know, everything, not, you know, it's just like another world and the whole rest of the reservation is just peaceful and quiet. You don't even see anybody outside. But like, it was the most fantastic thing. But they went there, and they're ranchers. Betty was in school till 1945, but during that time, her brother enlisted in the Army, in the Navy, and was on, I think, the Coral Sea that was shot down. He was on that and saved some of his friends, but not others, and he had trauma the rest of his life. Moses Jumper, who had also gone to school with her, was also in the Army, and he was put out as a sentinel on an island that was Japanese, and he would tell the ships and notify anybody who was coming or going. So Betty graduated, and her grandmother, who had said, "No school for you, kid," said, "I don't believe in school, but you finished what you believe, and that's good." So, I mean, the important thing was that you finish, that you do what you absolutely believe, and you do it well, and you finish. But having a high school education was not going to save any babies. So she went to the Kawa Teaching Hospital in Oklahoma, and then she went for field training at the Shawnee Field Training Center. So now she's a nurse. When she comes back, she's supposed to be a public health nurse, but the funds hadn't come in for it, so she's assigned to Jackson Memorial Hospital, and she's the interpreter. Her mother, and she through the years had convinced the mothers to go to the hospital to have the babies. And what she found out, that her mother didn't know how to suction anything out of the baby's throat, and that's why they were dying when her mother delivered them. So they convinced these people now to go to the hospital. One of the big problems when they went to the hospital was this. They don't stay where anyone has died. If someone dies in the village, they leave. They don't stay there anymore. They don't stay where someone died. So imagine you go in the hospital and you ask, has anybody died here? It was a bit of a problem. but now, you know, the babies were healthier. So she was the interpreter because she was the first one of the Seminoles to speak English, Miccosukee, and Muscovy. So she could talk to anybody. And that's what she did for my dad, because, you know, if that, and I didn't realize how important that was until I've been reading in the last few months. But so she was key to that. So finally the money comes through, and she and another nurse, now they're the public service nurse for Dania, Hollywood Reservation, the Brighton, which is all the way over and around on the northwest side of Lake Okeechobee, and then Big Cypress, which is 50 miles south of Lake Okeechobee. So they had a routine of going every, you know, once a week. They would pack up and take things to one place or the other. Now, don't believe that the people were standing there saying, "Oh, give me a shot, dear people." This was not anything that they were interested in. The only other thing is that Betty had been trained by her mother, so she knew a lot of the native things that would work. But when they didn't work, she knew what to do. One of the biggest problems, and when I was in school in the 1950s, we were even, the talk of hookworm was prevalent. Many of the children the Seminole children had hookworm. So there was a whole education about, and with hookworm, what happens, the worms begin to eat your blood, and you just get paler and paler and weaker. So she really felt that she was really doing the right thing. By the 1950s, the boarding school closed. And so now now what are we going to do? Where are these children going to go to school? I just got a note from my high school class that one of the Seminoles who had gone to my high school, South Brevard High School, died last week. So we had a few of the Seminole boys in our class. They were on the football team, but they didn't finish. But they did come to school. And you have to understand, when she first moved to the reservation, they had the school, but they didn't go. Their parents didn't want them to go. They didn't want to go. And so they'd go for a little while, and then they'd just get up and walk out. It was pretty hard on the teachers, I think. But they had them wash their faces in the morning, and they wore, and I tried to put on that display over there, they wore the necklaces, and Betty said when they were 13, they started getting a necklace every year. Well, her grandmother's necklace were out like this. And they didn't take them off every night, I guess. So the school was teaching them to take them off and clean themselves and that sort of thing. But the school closed. The reservation school closed because they didn't want to learn, and they didn't have to learn, and nobody cared except the people that were teaching. And so it didn't last. It didn't last very long at all. So there wasn't a school there. Again, Ada was working at the chimpanzee farm, right? Now this was a great place if you were a kid, because like my brother and I, we could go play with the monkeys, ride on the Galapagos turtles. And there was one monkey that would steal people's glasses. But he was a good friend of mine. So whenever he was taking something, then I could go, and he'd usually trade, leaves or something. I could get the glasses back. But in 1954, Ada was bitten by one of the monkeys at the chimpanzee farm. So they sued the chimpanzee farm, and they got enough money to build a real house. So from that money, they built a regular house on the reservation. 1955, really interesting. They put the turnpike right through the center of the reservation. So these were people that traveled back and forth could walk back and forth between the camps. They moved the original road. It was interesting because you could drive part of Sheridan Street went right through the reservation. You could not travel around too much through the reservation, but it was there. But now here's this huge chunk right out in the middle of the reservation, and they couldn't travel back and forth. But what they did happen, they had trouble trying to get loans to build a house, because you can't build a house on land you don't own, and they didn't own the reservation. So what happened is they organized, and the Seminole tribe of Florida was established, so that now they owned the land, and they built a subdivision on the west side of the turnpike. Betty was still the nurse. However, the money had run out in 1951. She kept working. She worked at that job until, I think, 1967 without pay. She had some people that would pay for her gas, and some people would give her something on the trips and so forth, but she was still the nurse. They started a Seminole Rodeo because now they're cowmen, Florida cowmen, and Iris Walls was telling me that they used to come from Indiantown down to the rodeo in Dania. So now they're beginning to make some money by holding the rodeo. They opened their own Indian village at the reservation, so they're starting to have some income. Betty, some of the other Indians have told me, was a truant officer. And she knew the whole reservation, and the rebel that she was, she knew where and when you would hide. And so there was one story that, the kid is out fishing or something, or swimming in the canal, and she gets him out, and he says, "Oh, I can't go to school, I don't have shoes." And she said, "Get in the car." And they went down and bought shoes, and she took him to school. So the big joke was you could not hide from Betty. When she decided you were going to school, there was no doubt about it. But you see what she's doing. She's taking care of her people. And this was one of her goals in life. She told me she wanted to read, and she wanted to help her people, and she wanted to write a book. In 1956, she starts a newspaper, the Seminole newspaper, and starts writing so that people could find out about each other and what was happening, and kind of give people positive strokes for what they were doing. When the Seminole tribe was formed, the Miccosukee did not want to have anything to do with it. And you have to understand, I never understood why this great division. Well, what happened is the great leader, big chief of all the Indians, name was Sam Jones. I can't pronounce his Indian name. I've never heard these Indian words spoken, so I don't want to say them because I don't want to do it wrong. But the Americans call him Sam Jones. And he had signed a peace treaty. And he stood by it. The Miccosukees didn't. They wanted to go on fighting. You know that the Third Seminole War was started right near us, down in St. Lucie County. After the Second Seminole War, they formed the Armed Occupation Colonies. So if you wanted land in along the coast here, you could bring your family down, sit on it for 5 years, clear at least an acre, and then it was your land. So we had some very noted people that were living here then. One of them became the governor of Florida. One of them was Miles Burnham, that eventually came and did the lighthouse here at Cape Canaveral. What happened? They were at peace. 3 or 4 of renegades, I guess, had started drinking at the Green Corn Dance, came over to St. Lucie, stopped and talked to everybody they knew, and then went out and shot Mr. Barker. You know, Barker's Bluff, you've seen well, this was Barker. He was also the revenue agent. Why would you have a revenue agent in a little colony? Well, the thing was that live oak trees were a big commodity because this was before we had metal ships. And so all the oak trees belonged to the United States, and you had to pay a tax when you took one down, and that's what he was there for. He also had a store, and it may be that he had cheated some people. Don't know. But they were against the truce that had been signed. So Sam Jones gets them, kills one, sent his hand through Billy Bowlegs to Tampa, to Fort Brooke, and said, "We found all of them, but one, we're still looking for him, and we'll bring him in. There's no fight." But the army was getting ready. I mean, they really were ready to fight. So they go out and they march into Billy Bowlegs' camp and stomp down his banana trees. That was enough. So you have the Third Seminole War. But the people of Sam Jones who kept the peace were the ones that had gone to Loxahatchee, then they had gone over on the west side of Lake Okeechobee to Catfish Creek, and the people outside called it Fish Eating Creek. They lived there till Jake Summerlin is coming over, and he's bringing his cattle because they're moving cattle from this area down the side, St. John's and across to Point Rasa, and he had cattle there. And he didn't have any trouble with the Indians. He sells it to somebody who has trouble with the Indians, and then they move up to a place called Bluefields. It was where the Addison family lived. Terrible thing happens at Bluefield. The tribe had 3 Negroes that had been bought long ago, but had grown up in the tribe. Now, what Betty told me about the relationship between the blacks, we call them slaves, but they didn't see them that way. They were not part of the clan, but they lived, they could have their own garden, they could have whatever, and they helped the Indians. So it was synergetic, but they were never part of the clan. So one of them was called Neggy Nancy, and she had a son. I think his name was Jim. And he decides he wants to marry an Indian. Well, that won't go over very big. And he was told no. Now, whether he got drunk or whether he just went crazy, nobody knows. But he went and started shooting in the village. He killed, I think, 5 people. Now, the Indian way is, if the men get out of hand, the women are to tie them up. I wish I had known this in my life a little earlier. You know, what happened? I mean, we're not going to have anybody out of hand, and it's the women who go and tie them up. And Betty's grandmother, Mary, was there trying to help the mother subdue this boy. She said, no, run away. He kills her. And so it was a terrible, terrible thing. And after that, they had to move from there, and they go to Indian Town. And so now I had figured out how they got to where they were after all these years. It was amazing how well governed they were. You know, death was not a thing that we think of. Betty's grandmother was born in 1860. She was the first baby that was allowed to live after the Seminole Wars. Why? If you're carrying a baby around and you're running from the soldiers and that baby cries, you're dead. So it's a different view. But you have to understand that Betty told me that they were the Tallahassee people. And I've just read Bartram's Travels in Florida, and he describes the Tallahassee Indians. They had 2-story houses. They had big farms. The women wore petticoats and long dresses, and they were a stable group of people. The thing is that Bartram made the comparison between the Tallahassee people and the Muskogees. What happens, the Tallahassee people had come down from western Georgia and Alabama, and the Choctaws were always right on their border, so they had to be vigilant. They had to be careful about what was happening. So, and they were very organized and very disciplined about what they were doing. Now the Muskogees, according to Bartram, were kind of devil-may-care. They moved from one place to the other. If it wasn't like they wanted, it went there, they went there. And some of this, I think, these differences in approach are what made the differences between the Miccosukis and the Muscovies. Now, Betty's family was a problem because they were both. They had intermarried. Like her, you know, her dad is speaking both languages. She's speaking both languages. So they're kind of not really accepted by the Miccosukis. In fact, you know, I was down at the Miccosuke reservation and the museum and so forth, and I mentioned Betty, and there was kind of, oh yes, we know her. Yeah. That's not her place. Those things carry on. And that's why I wanted to talk like we're on the porch. I mean, I could give you dates and generals and so forth, but I think to understand how and why people were as they were, they did not talk to white people. And there's stories about them coming, they came in here, they sold blueberries here. And there was a trading post at Bovine. They understand that we're all coastal oriented, but the first people coming through here were not coastal people. They were those Georgia crackers that were moving down slowly. Whenever the Indians were gone, they moved further down. When they were coming down to St. John's, that's the best pasture land in the country. And so Bovine was the first, I think it was the first county seat of Brevard County to the west. And even some of the people in O'Galley, they moved to O'Galley from out on the St. John's. I talked to Judge Platt as I was doing some of my research. They knew all the Indians. The Indians came back and forth. And one of the books said it was so shocking that the Indians really knew. They had waterways. They could go by water all the way down to St. John's. They could go all the way to Okeechobee and down all the way to the Everglades. And the same thing on the West Coast. They had waterways that they connected. And it's interesting that that we have, you know, the Historical Society, we don't even look at what happened out there. But that was the basis, and that was the economy of these people. When the Seminole tribe was formed, her brother Howard is the first president, and that was 1957. By 1959, the budget of the entire Seminole Nation was $35. Now, they were supposed to elect somebody new, but none of the men wanted the job because they weren't going to get paid. So Betty became the chief of the Seminole Nation. By the time she finished, they had $500,000 in their budget. She was the first and the only woman who has ever been a chief of the Seminoles, either the Seminoles or the Miccosukee, which formed in 1961. The Miccosukee Nation formed. So they're two different tribes, and I think that when we were fighting with them, we looked at them as one group, but in reality they were different groups. There was the Alachua group, you know, we just talked about Payne and Cowkeeper, and then there were the Tallahassee group, and then there were the Miccosukee. So they were all, and then the Yukis were the Indians that had been here before, and they would fight with different parts of the tribe whenever necessary. So that finally, the separation was made. Betty's husband, Moses, wrestled alligators for 17 years at the chimpanzee farm, I think it was in. And she said, and he was, from his trauma in the war, he was an alcoholic. And if he couldn't get in and wrestle, Betty did. And he also, you know, had handled the cattle out at Brighton. So Betty, as the chief, she gets a health clinic. The Betty May Jumper Health Clinic. Kids are in school. And she began the Indian festivals. And she even came up here once, and they used to have it at, well, BCC, it was called then, every year. And we did a movie about the history of the Indian River, and she was in the movie. And they were up here once at one of the festivals. And at the end of the movie, she said, well, you know, my mother told me that when the hurricane was coming, you'd see this bird, and then you would go into the glades. But I don't see that bird anymore. You know the bird? Right before the hurricane in 1979, my husband was going to stay home. And I'm 8 months pregnant, and I'm thinking, no, I'm not staying here. And so we leave right as the first band of the storm was coming, and what's out in front? A magnificent frigate bird. 6 foot wingspan. So when she was up here, I said, Betty, come here. I opened the book, or I had copied I said, look, that's the bird. She said, that's the bird, that's the bird, that's the bird. She had adopted a daughter. That's the bird. I'm not crazy. They had told her that, you know, she was crazy, that this couldn't be. But it was. So, well, she had this knowledge with the younger people. It was not accepted. Now they're in school. They want a real house. They're not going to live in the chiquita. Betty, by 1960, I mean, she can't keep being the chief with no money and the health nurse for no money. So she started working in a nursing home. She worked in a nursing home for several years. Her brother Howard dies in 1968. He was out on a heavy equipment, and the equipment rolled over on him. And it was like awful thing for her. She had, in 1948, she had a daughter with homocysteine. You're born, we call it water on the brain. I mean, it's not a problem now, but then it was fatal. She had 2 miscarriages. She had a son, who I remember as a baby. His father was called Big Shot. You know, this is Moses Jumper, and they all had their other names, and he was Big Shot, and so the little guy was Little Big Shot, and he's living down at the reservation in Big Cypress, and I asked about him, and they said, oh yeah, Big Shot. So now he's not little anymore. Then she adopted 2 girls. I guess these are older people, had children, and they weren't wanted. And so she raised the 2 girls. In 1970, President Nixon appoints her to the National Conference on Indian Opportunity. And she served for 16 years, looking at ways to get more jobs and education for Indians all over the country. And she organized a Southeast Indian group that she was chairman of and served for a long time. In 1974, she's the editor of the Seminole Tribune. Now the newspaper has come back, and she's now the editor and writer, and she writes, in fact, this research has just driven me absolutely crazy, because now I need to go find the Seminole Tribune and read it for the last 20 years to figure out. But she's very active. Now, one of the other things that she told me that she wanted to do was read, help her people, and write a book. So she writes to read. And she wrote with Patsy West, who was a teacher down at the Big Cypress Reservation. And she wrote Betty Mae Tiger, Seminole Legend. The Life of Betty Mae Tiger, Seminole Legend. There's a copy of it over there. And then she writes the legends and stories, because no one else knew the stories anymore. You know, we're sitting on the porch, we're talking about the stories. You might remember one. You might tell somebody else. But it's not written down. If you don't tell somebody else, there's no story. So she wrote them. And I just ordered a copy. I wrote down all those Indian stories. And then she was the narrator for a video called The Corn Lady. If you go on, if you go online, there are a bunch of cartoon Betty Jumper stories for children. So just go put her name in and you can watch the cartoons. So not only did she read the funny papers, now she is the funny paper. And we had her in the movie, the PBS movie that we did at MRC called Journey into Wilderness. And she described, you know, how they won the Seminole Wars. She said they were afraid of snakes, and they were afraid of alligators, and they didn't like the marshes. And so the way they defeated them was just lead them out into the place that they were the most scared and let them run around. You know? And that's basically what happened. It was, up until that time, the most expensive war. Those wars were the most expensive. They had more people die. It was probably the training for a lot of the generals in the Civil War. They all had served here. But that's how they won. And like I said, she ended it with, "I don't see that bird anymore." And we did. She got an honorary PhD from Florida State. And I didn't know this, but she was even listed as a badass lady of history. There's a Persephone magazine, but after they went through all the badass stuff, they decided that hers was a legacy with honor, respect, and accomplishment. And she was a friend. And it's not the kind of friend that talks a lot. It's the kind of friend that you know. And I think I know her better than I did. But she walked on in July 2011 at 88 years old. She was a friend. So, do you have any questions? Yeah.
Yes, it was excellent. Enjoyed it very much, Diane. Your talk, and I want to come to another one. I really do. I learned so much.
Well,
and I'm trying to, if I can just remember some of it.
Well, you will. You will.
I will. I'll pick it up, but I'll get the book. And I do want to ask: did Patrick Smith use her at all in any of her
I don't
work?
know. I haven't gone back to look at that. I don't think so. I don't think so. But I could look back and I'll read it again and see. I don't remember.
Did how many of the tribe members how many Miccosukee are on the at Brighton? At the
I don't know.
reservation?
I don't know.
Okay.
I really don't know.
Diane, is the chimpanzee farm also known as the monkey jungle?
No, that was in Miami.
Okay, it's a separate.
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, you know, in school once they showed us, you know, they take us in the auditorium to show a movie, and here were these people that, and I don't even remember their names. I mean, it's another thing I have to find out. But it was a great place. My best friend there was an orangutan. It was the most horrible thing. I don't go to zoos now. I cannot go to a zoo. He was on like a big platform with a collar and a chain. But he liked to smoke. Well, and it was so sad because, you know, he really, so once in a while I would bum a cigarette, you know, and get him a cigarette. But it was the most horrible thing. You know, I really, when I think of the money that we spent on zoos, that we could have gone to the place and taken care of them where they belong. Are
her books all still in print?
Betty's book? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have in fact, I went on Amazon last night and ordered the Legends book. This one, it's, there was a third book, With the Wagon Comes God's Word, and I've never seen it. So I need to try to find that one. It's called With the Wagon Comes God's Word. But I saw it on Amazon last night. The things up there I have, the 2 jackets and the blue skirt are ones that Betty made for my brothers and me. The other 2, the pink one over there and this one, I bought at thrift shops. And I wondered why I always knew when when her group had made a shirt or a skirt, and I found out why. One of the patterns is snake, and she's from the snake clan. So there was some way I knew they were familiar, but now I know why. It was the snake. The snake clan. But the books are available. I went to when I was at Big Cypress, I went and looked at the cost of some of the skirts and things, $125, $130, $200 for a skirt. The dolls I knew we sold for $3. Now they're like $25 to $30. I bought one. That's the only one I have. But when I think of this now, I think of Harriet Vidal teaching them to do this, and how it really kept them alive for so many years. So yeah, there's still Seminole things around. Yeah.
What years were we at the activity at Bovine?
Where?
The activities at Bovine in our
Oh, I just read that this week. Probably 1860s. One of the things were, when people were running away from being in the army, they came to Florida. So there were like gangs of people, of these men that would just go from place to place, and they were real rabble. I mean, they were just living off the land. But evidently, that trading post was well used, and the Platts, knew the Indians that were coming up and down. And he told me once that he went to North Carolina and saw, to one of the Indian villages or something, and here's 2 Seminoles, and they're dancing like a Cherokee. And he was, and what are you doing here? The other question? Yeah.
You talked about the revenue of the money going from a few thousand to $500,000 or something.
Yeah.
Was that the impact of the cigarette sales of the?
Could be. I mean, you have to understand that they're a separate nation now, so they don't pay sales tax. So yeah, I mean, my brother bought all his cigarettes there.
I lived there. I lived in Lauderdale in the '60s, and everybody wanted to buy the cigarettes from the Seminoles.
Yeah. So I mean, they started, businesses all along there. Yeah, I should have mentioned that.
They had drive-in windows.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, right now that Hollywood Reservation is the Hard Rock Cafe. And they are tearing down the one they had now, and they're building a building that's shaped like a guitar. And it's, from what I heard, you can see it for miles around. But we drove those Seminoles quite a while. But it's interesting that they're getting their money back from us in a big way, And now every Seminole gets a check every month from the proceeds from the casinos.
Have you seen those houses they're building for them down on Loop Road?
No.
They're building some pretty nice looking houses and duplexes for them. They're no more cheeky.
No more. And the thing is that by the time the kids started going to school, they were seeing how other people lived, and they weren't going to do that anymore. Down at Big Cypress, beautiful homes back in the woods, but it's really interesting. Outside every house, there's a chickie. Even the little restaurant, you window, you make your purchase, and then you sit in the chickie. Anybody else? Thank you for coming.